Your food tastes like a wet cardboard box had a midlife crisis in a spice cabinet. I read the words aloud, my spatula trembling, not with fear, but with the kind of pure, unadulterated rage that usually ends in a police report. My food truck, the Spice Vixen, was my kingdom. And this S. White had just dropped a digital pipe bomb on my 5-star rating. He didn't just hate the tacos, he called them aggressively average. Me? Average? I've outrun local health inspectors and survived 3 grease fires with better hair than most pageant queens. I don't care if he's a billionaire or a ghost. I'm going to find this man, and I'm going to make him choke on his own bad taste. Chapter 1. The Review That Started a War. The lunch rush was a symphony of chaos, and I was the conductor. The smell of searing carnitas and charred pineapple usually acted like a drug for me, but today, the air felt thick with the scent of impending doom. I wiped a smudge of chipotle mayo off my cheek and looked at my phone again. The notification was still there, glowing like a cursed artifact. 1 star. The chef clearly prioritizes volume over value, a bland, uninspired mess that lacks soul. S. White. Bland? I hissed, nearly dropping a tray of street corn. I put enough habanero in those carnitas to make a grown man cry for his mother. Saff, focus. Order 64 needs more lime. My assistant, Tino, yelled over the sizzle of the grill. I can't focus, Tino. S. White just called my soul uninspired. Do you know who S. White is? Tino didn't even look up. Probably some tech bro with a keyboard and a grudge. Forget it. But I wasn't built for forgetting. I was built for scorched earth retaliation. My father always said my temper was a liability, but in the food truck business, it was my fuel. By the time we closed the windows at 3 p.m., I had already done a deep dive into the digital footprint of the man who tried to kill my dream. S. White wasn't just a tech bro, he was Henry White, the golden alpha of White Industries. He was the kind of man who bought skyscrapers for breakfast and probably had his socks ironed by a specialized team of professionals. He's at the Sapphire Gala tonight, I muttered, showing Tino a social media post of a sleek, black-tie event happening at the museum. Saff, no, Tino said, backing away. That look in your eye involves a heavy cost, usually a lawsuit. I'm not going to sue him, Tino. I'm going to make him taste the mess he complained about. 2 hours later, I wasn't in my grease-stained apron. I was poured into a vintage red dress that screamed danger and carrying a thermal-insulated bag like it was a weapon of mass destruction. I didn't have an invitation, but I did have a fierce attitude and a way with security guards that involved promising them a lifetime supply of the Vixen's secret sauce. The gala was a sea of silk and boredom. Everyone looked like they'd forgotten how to smile, probably because they were eating tiny, flavorless crackers. Then I saw him. He was standing near a marble pillar, surrounded by a swarm of sycophants. He was taller than everyone else, his shoulders broad enough to have their own zip code, but it was his eyes that stopped me mid-stride. They weren't brown or amber. They were a molten, metallic gold. Even from across the room, I could feel a strange, thrumming energy radiating off him, something primal that made the hair on my arms stand up. Mr. White, I said, my voice cutting through the polite murmur of the crowd like a serrated blade. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over me. For a second, his nostrils flared, and his golden eyes narrowed as if he were catching a scent he couldn't quite identify. The air between us suddenly felt 10 degrees hotter. Do I know you? He asked. His voice was a low, velvet growl that vibrated right in the center of my chest. You know my tacos, I said, stepping into his personal space and ignoring the gasps of the socialites around us. I pulled a single, perfectly constructed taco from my bag, the steam rising in a delicious, defiant cloud. Ah, you called them bland. I'm here to tell you that your taste buds are either broken or you're a liar. Eat it. The crowd went silent. Henry White looked at the taco, then back at me. A slow, dangerous smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You're the girl from the truck," he murmured, leaning down so his lips were inches from my ear. "I didn't say the food was the only thing that lacked soul, Sandra. I said the chef was trying too hard." I bristled, my hand tightening on the taco tray. "Try this, or I'll make sure your Golden Alpha reputation is rebranded as the man who is afraid of a little spice." He reached out, his fingers brushing mine as he took the taco. The contact felt like an electric shock, a jolt of pure, unrefined heat that made my breath hitch. He didn't take a bite. Instead, he leaned in closer, his golden eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "I have very specific requirements for what enters my mouth, Sandra," he whispered, his voice dropping to a predatory frequency. "And right now, I'm thinking a taco is the last thing I want to taste." Before I could snap back a witty retort, his hand tightened on the tray, and his eyes flashed a brilliant, blinding gold. Chapter 2. The Golden-Eyed Snob. The air in the museum's grand hall didn't just feel hot anymore, it felt pressurized, like the moments right before a lightning strike. Henry White was still holding that taco, but he was looking at me as if I were the main course, and the taco was just an annoying garnish. His fingers were still wrapped around mine on the tray, and I could feel a literal hum coming from his skin. It wasn't a vibration. It was a pulse, steady and heavy, matching the thudding of my own heart. "You're making a scene, Mr. White," I whispered, though I wasn't doing much to pull away. My fierce streak usually kicked in when men tried to loom over me, but Henry wasn't just looming. He was absorbing the space around me. "I think you're the one who made the scene, Sandra," he rumbled, his golden eyes scanning my face with an intensity that felt like he was reading my thoughts. "Walking in here in a dress that looks like a fire hazard, carrying street food like a holy relic. You're bold, I'll give you that." "I'm not bold. I'm right," I countered, finally yanking the tray back toward my chest. "Now, are you going to eat it and admit you were wrong? Or are you going to keep standing there looking like you've never seen a carb before?" The socialites around us were whispering, their eyes darting between my vintage red silk and his tailored tuxedo. Henry didn't seem to notice them. His focus was a laser beam directed entirely at me. He took a slow, deliberate bite of the taco. I watched his throat move as he swallowed. My breath held in a tight knot. For a second, his expression didn't change. Then, his eyes widened, the gold in them swirling like stirred honey. He let out a sharp, ragged breath and staggered back half a step, slamming his hand against the marble pillar to steady himself. "What did you put in this?" he gasped, his voice sounding strained, almost pained. "Cilantro, lime, and my signature Vixen pepper blend," I said, my triumph immediately souring into concern. "Hey, are you okay? You look like you're having a stroke. It's spicy, but it's not deadly. It's everything," he muttered, his hand over his eyes. "The smell, the heat. It's like a physical weight. My senses. I can't." He looked up at me, and for the first time, the dominance was gone, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability that made my stomach do a slow, heavy flip. He looked overwhelmed, like a man drowning in a sea of flavor. "I didn't mean to call it bland," he choked out, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "I called it that because if I admitted what it actually did to me, I'd never be able to think about anything else. Your food doesn't lack soul, Sandra. It has too much of it. It's deafening." Before I could process the weirdest compliment I'd ever received, Henry grabbed my wrist. His grip was firm but oddly trembling. "Get me out of here," he commanded, though it sounded more like a plea. "Too many people, too much perfume. I need your truck. The quiet. Just get me out." I should have walked away. I should have told him to call his driver and his five-star doctors. But as I looked into those drowning golden eyes, my fierce protective streak, the one that usually defended my recipes, suddenly shifted toward the man who had just tried to destroy them. Fine, I snapped, tucking the tray back into my bag and grabbing his hand. But if you barf in my truck, I'm charging you a cleaning fee that'll make your stock prices drop. I led him through the service exit, ignoring the frantic calls of his assistants. We burst into the cool night air, Henry leaning heavily on me as we jogged toward where I'd illegally parked the Spice Vixen. As soon as we reached the stainless steel sanctuary of my truck, I fumbled with the keys and shoved him inside, locking the door behind us. The silence of the kitchen seemed to hit him like a physical relief. He slumped against the prep table, his head hanging low. "Better?" I asked, leaning against the fryer, my heart still racing from the escape. He looked up, the gold in his eyes glowing in the dim LED light of the truck. "Better," he whispered. He took a step toward me, the small space of the kitchen making his presence feel twice as large. "But we have a problem, Sandra." "What problem?" I asked, my voice suddenly small. "I can still smell the lime on your skin," he said, stepping into my personal space until my back hit the cold metal of the fridge. "And now that we're alone, I realized the taco wasn't the thing that was overwhelming my senses. It was you." He leaned down, his nose brushing against the curve of my neck, and I felt his entire body shudder. Just as I reached up to push him away, or pull him closer, I wasn't sure which. The entire truck rocked violently on its suspension, followed by a heavy, rhythmic scratching on the metal door from the outside. Chapter 3. The Kitchen Contract. "What the hell was that?" I hissed, my hands instinctively flying to Henry's shoulders to steady myself. The truck groaned again, tilting slightly to the left. "If that's a tow truck, I swear to God I will." "It's not a tow truck," Henry growled, his voice dropping an octave into something that sounded less like a man and more like a landslide. He moved with a speed that blurred my vision, shoving me behind him and putting his massive frame between me and the door. "Henry, you're acting crazy," I said, trying to peek around him. "It's probably just a stray dog or a drunk fan of my carnitas." "Sandra, stay back," he warned, his shoulders tensing under his tuxedo jacket. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whine that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the truck. Then, silence. Henry didn't move. He stood there like a statue of a god made of muscle and expensive wool, his ears twitching as if he were listening to a frequency I couldn't hear. After a tense minute, he let out a long, ragged sigh and relaxed his posture. "They're gone." "Who is they?" I demanded, stepping out from behind him and crossing my arms over my chest. "And why are your eyes still doing that glowing thing? Is it a billionaire biohacking thing? Do you have LED implants?" Henry turned to look at me, and the corners of his mouth twitched into a dry, humorless smile. "I wish. It would be much easier to explain." He sat down on a stool by the prep station, looking suddenly exhausted. "I'm an alpha, Sandra. Not just of a company, of a pack." I stared at him for a long beat. "Like, wolves? You're telling me you're a werewolf? In a three-piece suit?" "The suit is optional," he muttered. "The senses are not. Everything is amplified for me. Sound, light, and especially taste. Most food tastes like ash or chemicals. Your truck was the first thing in 3 years that smelled real." It hit me like a physical blow at the gala. I panicked. I wrote that review because I wanted to stay away. I wanted to convince myself you weren't what my wolf thought you were. "And what did your wolf think I was?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Henry looked at me, his gaze dropping to my lips before snapping back to my eyes. "His mate, his match. The fire he's been looking for to drown out the noise." I let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. "Okay, slow down, big bad wolf. I'm a chef. I don't do destiny. I do recipes. I do hard work. I don't belong to anyone just because their nose says so. I know, he said, his voice surprisingly soft. And I don't want a mate who just follows a scent. I want the woman who had the guts to shove a taco in my face in front of the entire city's elite. He stood up, the heat from his body radiating toward me again. But my review is viral. Your business is hurting because of my lapse in judgment. I want to fix it. Not with money. I know you'd throw a check back in my face. Damn right I would, I snapped, though I was secretly impressed he knew that. So, a contract, Henry proposed, stepping closer. 3 weeks, 3 private tastings. I want to see if I can handle the heat you bring. If I can, I'll write a retraction that will make you the most famous chef in this state. I'll admit I was wrong. I'll give you everything your business needs. And if you can't handle it, then I'll leave you alone. I'll disappear. No more reviews. No more S. White. You never have to see me again. I looked at him, this golden-eyed enigma who was currently occupying far too much space in my kitchen. My fierce heart told me to kick him out, but my business brain told me this was the only way to save the Spice Vixen. Plus, there was a small, rebellious part of me that wanted to see if I could actually break him with my cooking. Fine, I said, sticking out my hand. 3 tastings. But I set the menu. And if you try that mate talk again while I'm holding a knife, all bets are off. Henry took my hand, his palm warm and calloused. He didn't shake it. He pulled me slightly closer, his eyes flashing gold one last time. Deal, he murmured. But Sandra, you should know something about alphas. What's that? He leaned down, his breath hot against my ear. We don't just have high standards for food. We're very, very possessive of the things we find delicious. He let go of my hand and turned toward the door, but before he could open it, a loud, official-sounding knock echoed through the truck. Police! Open up! We have a report of a kidnapping at the museum gala. Henry froze, a mischievous glint in his eyes. Well, Sandra, it looks like our first tasting might have to be in a holding cell. Chapter 4. Heat and Habaneros. The blue and red lights of the squad car strobed against the stainless steel walls of the truck, making the whole scene look like a high-stakes disco. Henry didn't look worried. He looked annoyed, like the police were a minor technical glitch in his evening. I, on the other hand, was calculating the cost of a bail bondsman and wondering if attempted taco seduction was a felony. Stay here, Henry murmured, his hand lingering on the latch. Like hell I will, I snapped, pushing past him. It's my truck, my name on the permit, and my vintage dress. I'm not hiding behind the deep fryer while you play the hero. I swung the door open before he could stop me. 2 officers stood there, looking confused by the smell of high-end perfume mixed with habanero oil. Behind them, a black SUV sat idling, and a man who looked like he was carved out of granite, Henry's head of security, I assumed, stepped forward. Mr. White, the board was concerned when you vanished with a civilian, the security guy said, his eyes darting to me with a mix of suspicion and professional boredom. The civilian is the best chef in this city, Theodore, Henry said, stepping out onto the asphalt with a grace that shouldn't belong to a man his size. And I wasn't kidnapped. I was being educated. Tell the officers there's been a misunderstanding. While Henry did the billionaire hand-waving thing that makes legal problems disappear, I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. My heart was still hammering, but not from the cops. And it was the way Henry had said my name, like it was a secret he'd been keeping for years. 10 minutes later, the lights were gone, but the air was still heavy. Henry turned back to me, the street lamp catching the gold in his eyes. The first tasting. Tomorrow night. My place. 9 p.m. My truck or nothing, White, I said, my fierce pride flaring up. I don't cook in sterile billionaire kitchens with marble islands that have never seen a drop of grease. You want the soul? You come to the source. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. Tomorrow, 9 p.m., I'll bring the wine. You bring the fire. The next night, the city was unusually quiet. I parked the truck in a secluded lot overlooking the river, the kind of place where the only witnesses were the stars and the occasional stray cat. I was nervous, which pissed me off. When I'd cooked for mayors and celebrities, but Henry White made me feel like I was auditioning for my own life. I was prepping my Inferno carnitas when the heavy thud of a car door echoed through the lot. Henry didn't knock, he just stepped into the truck, shedding his blazer and rolling up his sleeves. His forearms were thick, corded with muscle, and covered in a faint dusting of dark hair that made my mouth go dry. "You're late," I lied. He was exactly on time. "I had to handle a pack dispute," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate the hanging ladles. Apparently, word has gotten out that the Alpha has developed a taste for something spicy. "Let's see if you can handle the real thing first," I said, handing him a plate. I dialed the heat up to an 11. It wasn't just spice, it was a complex, a layering of 3 different smoked peppers and a hint of dark chocolate to ground the flavors. He took a bite. I watched his jaw lock. His pupils dilated until his eyes were almost entirely black, the gold rimming the edges like a solar eclipse. He didn't gag. He didn't reach for water. Instead, he gripped the edge of the prep table so hard the metal groaned. "Sandra," he groaned, his voice sounding like it was being dragged over gravel. "Too much?" I asked, a smirk playing on my lips. "No," he whispered, stepping so close I could feel the heat radiating off his chest. "It's perfect. It's the first time in a decade I can actually feel something other than the static in my head." He reached out, his thumb catching a stray drop of sauce at the corner of my mouth. The touch was electric, a jolt of pure, unadulterated sensation that made my knees weak. He didn't pull away. He leaned in, his scent, cedar, rain, and something metallic, overwhelming my own cooking. Just as his lips were a breath away from mine, a low, haunting howl ripped through the night air, followed by the sound of something heavy landing on the roof of the truck with a bone-jarring thud. Chapter 5. Sensory Overload. The entire truck rocked as if hit by a wrecking ball. Pots clattered to the floor, and I lost my footing, tumbling right into Henry's arms. He caught me effortlessly, his grip like iron, but his attention was fixed on the ceiling. "Stay. Under. The counter," he hissed, his voice dropping into a register that didn't sound human. "What is that?" I whispered, my heart trying to beat its way out of my ribs. "Henry, what's happening?" "A challenger," he growled. The gold in his eyes wasn't just swirling now. It was glowing with a fierce internal light. "My pack. They think I've grown soft. They think I'm distracted by a human." The scratching started again. Long, slow, screeching sounds of claws dragging across the reinforced steel roof. It sounded like someone was trying to open a giant tin can. My beautiful truck. My livelihood. That was when my fear turned into cold, hard fury. "Oh, no you don't," I muttered, reaching for my heavy-duty cast-iron skillet. "Sandra, don't be a fool," Henry barked, reaching for me, but he suddenly winced, clutching his head. "The noise. The smelling. It's too much. I can't focus." The intruder on the roof let out a snarl that sounded like a chainsaw, and the metal actually started to buckle inward. Henry was on his knees now, his heightened senses turning the screeching metal into a weapon against him. He was vulnerable, and it was my fault for bringing him here. I didn't think. I grabbed a bottle of my concentrated Vixen's Revenge hot sauce, the stuff I keep under lock and key, and a spray bottle of vinegar. I kicked the back door open. "Hey! Get off my roof, you overgrown furball!" I screamed. In the moonlight, a wolf the size of a grizzly bear was perched on the top of my truck. Its fur was midnight black, and its eyes were a sickly, pale yellow. It looked down at me, baring teeth that were longer than my steak knives. It prepared to spring, its muscles bunching for a lethal leap. I didn't flinch. I sprayed the vinegar pepper mix directly into the air between us. The wind caught it, creating a stinging, spicy cloud. The wolf's nose, thousands of times more sensitive than a human's, took the full hit. It let out a pathetic yelp, sneezing so hard it practically fell off the roof. I stepped back inside and slammed the door, locking it just as Henry managed to stand up. He looked at me, his face a mask of shock. You pepper sprayed a beta of the North Pack? He was denting my roof, Henry. I don't care if he's the King of England, I shouted, my adrenaline finally redlining. And don't look at me like that. You're the one who needs to get your senses under control. You're an alpha, right? Then start acting like it and stop letting a little noise ruin your day. The silence that followed was heavy. Henry stared at me, his chest heaving. Slowly, the glow in his eyes began to fade, replaced by a look of profound, terrifying respect. You're right, he whispered. I've been fighting the world for too long. I forgot how to just be. He walked over to the stove, where the remains of the carnitas were still simmering. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes. Teach me, Sandra. Teach me how you balance the heat without getting burned. It's not a lesson, Henry. It's a feeling, I said, my voice softening. The rest of the night was a blur of quiet conversation and shared bites of food. We didn't talk about wolves or billionaires. We talked about the way cilantro should always be fresh and why a taco is the perfect metaphor for life. Messy, complex, and best enjoyed with someone else. By the time the sun started to creep over the horizon, Henry was sitting on the floor of the truck, leaning against the fridge, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. Second tasting, success, he murmured. But the third one has to be different. How different? I asked, cleaning the grill. It has to be public, he said, his expression turning serious. The pack needs to see that I've chosen you. Not because of a scent, but because you're the only person who can stand in the fire with me. He stood up and walked to the door, but paused with his hand on the handle. There's an old festival in the hills tomorrow night, the Blood Moon Market. If you show up with your truck, I'll make my announcement. But Sandra, they won't make it easy for you. They'll test you. Let them, I said, my fierce pride back in full force. I've got enough habaneros to take down a whole army. He laughed, a rich, warm sound that made my heart skip. But as he stepped out of the truck, his smile vanished. He looked at the ground, then back at me. Sandra, I didn't tell you the whole truth about the one-star review. Chapter 6. The Accidental Date. Oh, here we go, I said, throwing my dish towel onto the counter. What now? Did you also call the health inspector? Did you tell the city I'm actually a front for a taco-based cult? Henry shook his head, his golden eyes fixed on the pavement. No. I wrote that review because I saw you 6 months ago, at the downtown farmer's market. You were arguing with a vegetable wholesaler about the quality of his radishes. You were terrifying and beautiful. I blinked. 6 months? You've been stalking me for 6 months? I was trying to stay away, he defended, stepping back toward the truck. I knew the moment I saw you that you were the one, but alphas aren't supposed to fall for humans who can hold their own in a shouting match. I thought if I ruined your reputation, I'd stop thinking about you. I thought I could kill the attraction with a 1-star review. Well, that was a stupid plan, I said, though a strange warmth was spreading through my chest. You really are a grump, aren't you? I'm working on it, he muttered. The next day was a whirlwind. I had to restock, fix the dent in the roof, which I billed to White Industries, and prepare for the Blood Moon market. If Henry wanted a public declaration, I was going to give him a meal they'd never forget. The market was held in a clearing deep in the woods, lit by hundreds of lanterns and a moon that was starting to take on a reddish hue. It wasn't just a werewolf gathering. It was a high-end secret festival for the supernatural elite. There were no dragons or magic wands, just people who looked a little too athletic and smelled a little too much like the wild. I pulled the Spice Vixen into my assigned spot, right next to a booth selling organic elk jerky. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a paring knife. Every pair of eyes that turned toward me was some shade of amber or gold. "Keep it together, Saff," I whispered to myself, firing up the grill. "They're just hungry dogs in expensive shoes." Henry arrived an hour later, looking like royalty in a dark charcoal sweater and jeans. He didn't go to the VIP tent. He came straight to my window. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low and intimate. "Ready to feed them or fight them?" I asked, tossing a handful of onions onto the flat top. "Both," he said, leaning over the counter and kissing me. It wasn't a test kiss. It was a slow, deep claim of a kiss that tasted like the promise of a very long night. The entire market went dead silent. "Order up!" I shouted, pulling away with a smirk, my face flushed. The night was a blur of activity. I served hundreds of tacos, each one perfected with the sensory needs of a shifter in mind. Less salt, more aromatic herbs, and just enough spice to keep them interested. Henry stayed by my side the entire time, acting as the world's most overqualified busboy. But as the moon reached its peak, a tall, elegant woman with hair as white as bone stepped up to the window. She didn't look hungry. She looked like she wanted to see me bleed. "So, this is the little chef," she said, her voice like ice. "The one who thinks a little seasoning can replace 1,000 years of tradition." "The seasoning is just the beginning," I said, meeting her cold gaze. "Would you like to try the Vixen special? Or are you just here to critique the decor?" The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She leaned in closer, her scent shifting to something sharp and ozone-heavy. "Henry thinks you're his mate, but a mate is a partner in all things, Sandra. Can you protect the pack? Or are you just a temporary distraction?" Before I could answer, she reached out and grabbed my arm, her grip unnaturally strong. At the same moment, the ground beneath the food truck began to tremble, and a low, booming sound, like a mountain cracking open, echoed from the nearby forest. Henry's head snapped toward the woods, his eyes turning a violent, blinding gold. "He's here," he whispered, his face pale. "The one person I told you didn't exist." The woman let go of me, her expression shifting from malice to pure, unadulterated terror. "The review wasn't the only thing Henry was lying about, Sandra." Run. Chapter 7. Sizzling near misses. The ground didn't just tremble, it buckled. A hairline fracture sprinted across the pavement of the Blood Moon market, and for a terrifying second, I thought the earth was going to swallow my food truck whole. The woman with the bone-white hair vanished into the shadows of the crowd, leaving me staring at Henry. His posture had shifted from protective to predatory, in a way that made the air feel like it was vibrating with static electricity. "Henry, who is he?" I yelled over the sudden, panicked roar of the crowd. Shifters were scattering, jumping into the trees, or shifting into their fur forms mid-run. "You said there was no magic, no ancient monsters. But you said this was just about tacos and bad reviews." "I lied," Henry barked, his voice sounding more like a thunderclap than a human sentence. He grabbed the ledge of the truck window, his knuckles white. "He isn't a monster, Sandra. He's my brother. And he's the reason I've spent my life pretending my senses were broken." Before I could demand an itemized list of every other lie he'd told me, a figure stepped out of the tree line. He looked like Henry, but if Henry was a controlled, polished flame, This man was a forest fire. He wore a tattered leather jacket and moved with a jagged, twitchy energy that set my teeth on edge. "Big brother," the man laughed, the sound echoing through the clearing. "I see you've finally found a snack worth coming out of the penthouse for." "Stay back, Elias," Henry warned, his eyes glowing with a ferocity that made my heart hammer against my ribs. "She is off limits. To everyone." Elias, the brother I didn't know existed, took a deep, exaggerated sniff of the air. "The Vixen's spice. I can smell it from the ridge, but it's not the peppers that are making my heart race, Henry. It's her." I didn't wait for Henry to defend me. I grabbed the nearest thing at hand, a gallon-sized jug of my fermented pineapple vinegar, and stepped out of the truck. "I don't know which one of you is the bigger drama queen, but you're scaring off my customers and ruining my inventory. If you want a piece of me, Elias, you're going to have to wait in line behind the health inspector and the beta I already pepper-sprayed tonight." Elias stopped dead, his eyebrows shooting up. He looked at Henry, then back at me, a slow, wicked grin spreading across his face. "She's fierce. I see why you're obsessed. But can she handle the truth about the white legacy?" "She doesn't need to handle anything," Henry growled, stepping between us. "She's a chef, not a soldier." "I can speak for myself, Goldilocks," I snapped, poking Henry in his massive, tensed shoulder. "If there's a white legacy that involves people shaking the ground and acting like lunatics, I'd like to know before I sign up for tasting number 3. The tension was a physical weight. Henry looked at me, the gold in his eyes softening into a look of pure, agonizing conflict. "Elias represents everything I tried to leave behind, Sandra. The violence, the power struggles, the things that make our senses a curse rather than a gift. I wanted to protect you from this." "By lying to me?" I asked, my voice dropping. "I'm not a porcelain doll, Henry. I run a food truck in the city. I've dealt with worse than a grumpy brother with a leather jacket." The ground shook again, but this time it wasn't a tectonic shift. It was a fleet of black SUVs roaring into the clearing, their headlights blinding us. Henry's security team? No. These vehicles had a different insignia, a stylized wolf's head with a dagger through it. "The council," Elias whispered, his bravado instantly evaporating. "They aren't here for the tacos, Henry. They're here because you claimed a human as a mate on public ground." Henry grabbed my hand, his grip tighter than ever. "We have to go. Now." "My truck!" I screamed as he started pulling me toward his own car. "Leave it." "I am not leaving my truck." I planted my feet, my fierce pride overriding my survival instinct. "If you want me to go, we're going in the Spice Vixen." Henry looked at the approaching SUVs, then at my stubborn, furious face. He let out a frustrated growl. "Fine, get in the driver's seat, I'll handle the gates." We scrambled into the truck just as the first SUV doors flew open. I slammed the engine into gear, the familiar roar of the diesel engine giving me a surge of confidence. But as I looked in the rearview mirror, I didn't see the council. I saw Elias standing in the middle of the road, holding a small, glowing glass vial he'd snatched from my prep table. "Hey, that's my secret sauce," I yelled. Elias winked at me and threw the vial into the path of the lead SUV. A massive, blinding explosion of red smoke and habanero mist filled the air, and the screeching of tires echoed through the woods. "Drive, Sandra," Henry yelled. I floored it, the truck fishtailing as we sped into the dark forest. We were safe for now, but the silence between us was deafening. Henry was staring out the window, his jaw tight. "You have exactly 5 minutes to tell me everything," I said, my voice trembling with adrenaline, "or I'm kicking you out of this truck at 60 miles per hour. "The third tasting," Henry said, ignoring my threat. "It has to happen tonight, at my family's old estate." "Why?" "Because," he said, turning to look at me, his eyes dark and heavy. It's the only place where I can show you why the Golden Alpha is a title I never wanted, and why you're the only person who can help me burn it down. Chapter 8. The Alpha's Secret. The White Estate wasn't a house. It was a fortress of stone and ivy. I'd hidden behind a gate that looked like it belonged in a gothic horror novel. I parked the truck right on the manicured lawn, the tires leaving deep ruts in the expensive grass. I didn't care. I was too busy staring at the man beside me. Henry hadn't spoken since we left the woods. He looked older, the shadows under his eyes more pronounced in the moonlight. We stepped out of the truck, the air here smelling of ancient pine and something heavy, like old iron. "This is where it started," he said, leading me toward a massive set of oak doors. The Picky Eater review wasn't just a lapse in judgment, Sandra. It was a warning to myself. My father. He died in this house because he couldn't handle the sensory input of his own power. He went mad from the noise of the world. I followed him into a grand library that smelled of leather and dust. "And you think the same thing is happening to you?" "It was happening to me," he said, turning to face me. "Until I smelled your kitchen. Until I tasted that first taco at the gala. It didn't just taste good, Sandra. It grounded me. It gave the chaos a center." He walked over to a bookshelf and pulled a hidden lever. A wall slid back to reveal a small, clinical-looking kitchen. It was cold, metallic, and utterly devoid of life. "This is where I've eaten every meal for 5 years," he said, his voice hollow. "Flavorless protein, distilled water. I thought if I turned off my senses, I could keep the madness away. I thought I could be a perfect alpha by being a robot." "Henry." I stepped toward him, my fierce anger melting into a deep, aching empathy. To live like this, a man with so much power and so much sensory potential, trapped in a gray box, it was a tragedy. "That's not living. That's just not dying." "I know," he whispered. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw. "And then you came along, crashing into my world with your red dress and your spicy attitude. You didn't just challenge my review, you challenged my entire way of existing." He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. The intimacy was overwhelming, more than any kiss. I could feel his heartbeat, fast and frantic, like a bird trapped in a cage. "But the council, they don't want a grounded alpha," he continued. "They want a weapon. They want me to use my heightened senses to hunt, to dominate, to expand the white influence. They see my connection to you as a weakness they can exploit. They'll try to use you to control me." "Let them try," I said, my voice hardening. "I told you I'm not a pawn. If they want to get to you through me, they're going to find out that I'm the one who controls the heat in this relationship." Henry let out a short, dry laugh, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. "I have no doubt about that." He led me back to the truck. "The third tasting. It's not for me, Sandra, it's for them. They're coming here. Tonight. They want to see if a human mate can truly sustain an alpha of my line. They want a demonstration." "A demonstration of what?" I asked, already planning my menu. "Of your fire," he said. "They believe that a human mate will make me soft. I need you to show them that you make me dangerous." I spent the next 2 hours in the truck, working with a feverish intensity. I wasn't just cooking, I was composing a manifesto. I used every spice, every herb, every trick I'd learned on the streets. I made a mole sauce that took 40 ingredients and a lifetime of soul to balance. As the clock struck midnight, the library doors flew open. 5 men and women in dark suits marched in, their eyes all varying shades of predatory yellow. They sat at a long mahogany table, looking at me like I was an interesting specimen under a microscope. "Begin," the eldest man said, his voice like dry parchment. I served the first course, a chilled gazpacho with a kick that hit the back of the throat like a secret. They ate in silence, their expressions unreadable. Then the second, a trio of tacos, each one a different level of sensory complexity. Henry sat at the head of the table, his eyes fixed on me, encouraging me. I could feel the thrumming energy in the room and the collective power of the council trying to press down on me. But I stood my ground, my spatula held like a scepter. "And for the final course?" the elder asked, wiping a smudge of sauce from his lip. "The vixen's heart," I said, placing a small steaming dish in front of each of them. It was a simple chocolate ganache, infused with a rare chili that didn't burn. It glowed. It was the physical manifestation of the intimacy Henry and I had shared in the truck. As they took the first bite, the room went silent. One by one, their eyes began to glow, not with aggression, but with a strange, shimmering clarity. The tension in the room snapped. It's impossible," the elder whispered. "The resonance, it's perfect." He looked at Henry, then at me. "You have found a stabilizer. A human who can handle the alpha's frequency." "I told you," Henry said, standing up and walking to my side. He put his arm around my waist, his grip possessive and proud. "She isn't my weakness. She is my strength." The council rose as one, bowing their heads in a rare show of respect. They filed out of the room without another word, leaving Henry and me alone in the dim light of the library. "We did it," I whispered, leaning into him. "We did," he said, turning me in his arms. "But there's one more thing, Sandra. Something the council didn't see." "What's that?" He pulled a small, ancient-looking scroll from his pocket. "Elias didn't just steal your sauce tonight. He left this in your truck. It's the true title to the White Estate. And according to this, I'm not the only alpha in the family." Chapter 9. The Fated Mate Reveal. I stared at the scroll. The ink faded, but the words clear. It wasn't a legal document in the human sense. It was a blood-bound contract. It didn't just list property, it listed lineages. And there, at the very bottom, next to Henry's name, was a space that had been blank for a century. Until now. My name was appearing on the parchment in a faint glowing script. "What is this?" I breathed, my hand trembling as I touched the paper. "Henry, what's happening?" "The bond isn't just a feeling, Sandra," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's a literal rewriting of the legacy. By accepting me, by standing in that fire tonight, you didn't just become my partner. You became a part of the Pack's foundation. The fated mate isn't a fairy tale. It's a biological and spiritual anchor." I looked from the scroll to Henry. My fierce independence was screaming at me. "You belong to yourself. You built your truck. You don't need a magic scroll to tell you who you are." "I don't like this," I said, stepping back, my heels clicking on the marble floor. "I'm Sandra Jones. I'm a chef. I'm not a biological anchor. I'm not a line on a piece of paper." "I know you aren't," Henry said, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "The scroll is just a reflection of what's already happened. You chose me, Sandra, and I chose you. The fate part. It's just the universe agreeing with us." "The universe can mind its own business," I snapped, my eyes stinging. "I wanted a boyfriend, Henry. Maybe a business partner. I didn't want to be part of a shifter dynasty." "Then don't be," he said, stepping closer until he was just an inch away. "We can leave, right now. We can take the truck, drive to the coast, and never look back. I don't care about the estate. I don't care about the council. I only care about the woman who pepper-sprayed a wolf for denting her roof." I looked into his golden eyes, and for the first time, I saw the true weight of his sacrifice. He was willing to give up everything, his power, his family, his name, just for a life of frying carnitas by my side. "You'd really do that?" I asked. "In a heartbeat," he whispered. I took a long, shaky breath. The fear was still there, but so was the heat. the same heat that had been simmering between us since that first disastrous review. I looked at the scroll, then back at him. "We aren't leaving," I said, my voice regaining its fierce edge. "If I'm the anchor for this family, then I'm going to make sure this family starts acting like humans. No more gray kitchens, no more secret vials, and we are definitely opening a second food truck on the estate grounds." Henry laughed, a sound of pure, unbridled joy. He picked me up and spun me around, his strength making me feel weightless. "Whatever you want, Sandra. You're the boss." He set me down and kissed me, a long, slow seal of a promise. But as we stood there in the quiet library, the air suddenly turned cold. The lights flickered and died, leaving us in total darkness. From the hallway, I heard a slow, rhythmic clapping. "Bravo," a voice whispered. It wasn't Elias. It wasn't the council. It was a voice that sounded like it was made of shadows and broken glass. "A beautiful sentiment, truly. But there's a small problem with your happily ever after, Henry." A single violet-colored flame ignited in the center of the room, revealing a man I'd never seen before. He was dressed in a pristine white suit, and his eyes weren't gold or yellow. They were a flat, lifeless gray. "Who are you?" I demanded, stepping in front of Henry, my hand instinctively reaching for the small paring knife I always kept in my pocket. "The man who actually wrote that one-star review," the stranger said, tilting his head with a sickeningly sweet smile. Henry just took the credit because he was too embarrassed to admit that someone had already found his mate before he did. He looked at me, his gray eyes turning a dark, bruised purple. "Hello, Sandra. It's time to pay for the soul you put into your cooking. And I've come to collect the debt." Behind him, the library doors didn't just open, they were ripped off their hinges by a force that felt like a physical scream. Chapter 10. The Rival Truck. The man in the white suit didn't flinch at the sight of my paring knife. He just continued to smile, a cold, clinical expression that made the golden alpha next to me look like a cuddly puppy. Henry was vibrating with a low, subharmonic growl that rattled the library's shelves, but his eyes were wide with a rare, shimmering fear. "Victor," Henry spat, the name sounding like a curse. "I told you to stay in the city. Sandra has nothing to do with our arrangement." "Oh, but she has everything to do with it now," Victor said, his gray eyes tracking the way I stepped in front of Henry. "You see, Sandra, Henry didn't just want to save his own senses. He made a bargain years ago to protect his pack from the sensory madness. The price was a debt of service, a debt he thought he could pay off with money." "And you're the debt collector?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fact that the room felt like it was dropping into an Arctic winter. "Well, you're out of luck. My kitchen doesn't have a tab for creepy guys in suits." Victor's laugh was like dry leaves skittering on a grave. "I don't want money. I want the source of his stability. I've launched my own venture. A rival truck, you might say. The Obsidian Pallet. It's parked right outside your city lot. And while you've been playing house in this fortress, I've been serving my own soul to the masses." "You're a chef?" I asked, incredulous. "I am a purveyor of experience," Victor corrected. "And tonight, the city decides who stays. If your soul is as fierce as Henry claims, come back to the streets. If you lose the lunch rush tomorrow, you and Henry are coming with me to settle the debt in my private kitchen. Permanently." The violet flame puffed out, leaving us in a darkness that smelled of burnt ozone and expensive cologne. "We aren't going," Henry said, grabbing my shoulders. "He's dangerous, Sandra. He's a sensory leech. He feeds on the intensity of others. That's why his eyes are gray. He's empty." "He's also parked in my spot," I said, my fierce pride finally boiling over. "Henry, nobody tells me I'm losing a lunch rush before I've even fired up the grill. If he wants a war, he's got one. But we aren't doing this his way." We spent the rest of the night prepping. Henry tried to convince me to hide, but he eventually realized that trying to stop Sandra Jones from defending her business was like trying to stop a hurricane with a wet napkin. By 11 a.m. the next morning, the Spice Vixen was back in its prime spot downtown. Directly across the street sat a matte black truck that looked like it had been designed by a Bond villain, the Obsidian Palette. It didn't have a menu. It just had a sign that read, "Everything you've ever craved." A crowd was already forming, but they weren't the usual happy lunch crowd. They looked dazed, moving toward Victor's truck like zombies. "He's using his frequency," Henry whispered, standing behind me in the truck. He was wearing a plain black t-shirt and an apron, looking like the world's most intimidating sous chef. "He's projecting a sense of hunger that isn't real." "Then we'll give them something more real than his tricks," I said, slamming a fresh batch of tortillas onto the heat. "Henry, I need you to focus. Don't fight the noise. Use it. Tell me what every person in that line is actually feeling, not the fake hunger, the real stuff. Grief, joy, boredom. Give me the data." Henry closed his eyes, his nostrils flaring. "The woman in the blue coat. She's mourning a loss. The man with the briefcase is terrified of failing his presentation." "Got it," I said, my hands moving in a blur. For the woman, a cinnamon-dusted churro taco with a hint of sea salt to acknowledge the tears. For the businessman, a blast of citrus and ginger to sharpen his nerves. As the scent of real, honest-to-God food began to drift across the street, the zombies started to blink. The artificial hunger Victor was projecting began to clash with the genuine, soul-deep comfort coming from my grill. "It's working," Henry breathed, a grin breaking through his stoic mask. "The noise is changing. It's becoming harmonious." Victor stepped out of his black truck, his gray eyes flashing with a violent bruised purple. He looked across the street at me and raised a hand. Suddenly, the gas line on my grill hissed, and the flames leaped 6 feet into the air, licking at the ceiling of the truck. Chapter 11. Vulnerability in the Van. "Saff, get out!" Henry roared, lunging for me as the grease on the flat top ignited. I didn't run. I grabbed the fire extinguisher and blasted the flames, but the heat didn't die down. It wasn't a normal fire. It was fueled by Victor's sheer petty malice. The internal temperature of the truck skyrocketed to 120 degrees in seconds. "The fire suppression system isn't kicking in," I yelled, coughing as thick, spicy smoke filled the cabin. "He's jamming the electronics." Henry grabbed me, shielding my body with his own as a window shattered from the pressure. He kicked the back door open and hauled me out into the alleyway, just as a muffled whoomp signaled the end of my prep for the day. The Spice Vixen wasn't destroyed, but it was out of commission. We sat on the damp pavement of the alley, both of us covered in soot and smelling like scorched chili. I looked at my hands. They were shaking. Not from fear, but from the realization that I had almost lost everything I'd worked for. "I'm sorry," Henry whispered, sitting beside me. He looked defeated, his broad shoulders slumped. "This is what happens when people get close to me. My world is a series of fires, Sandra. I should have stayed the grump in the penthouse." I looked at him, really looked at him. The golden alpha was gone. In his place was just a man who was terrified that his very existence was a toxin to the people he loved. "Don't you dare," I said, my voice raspy from the smoke. "Don't you dare apologize for being a fire. I'm a chef, Henry. I live in the fire. I choose the fire." I reached out and took his hand, my fingers interlaced with his. For the first time, I didn't feel the alpha frequency. I felt his vulnerability, a deep, quiet hum of loneliness that had been there since he was a child. "Henry, look at me," I commanded. He turned his head, his golden eyes dull. "Victor thinks he won because he broke my equipment. But he doesn't understand the master rules. It's not about the truck. It's about the person behind the spatula. We don't have a kitchen, Sandra. We don't have power. We have a rainy alleyway and a bag of supplies I saved from the fire, I said, pointing to the thermal bag I'd instinctively grabbed. And we have a billionaire who knows every secret rooftop in this city. A slow, tentative smile touched Henry's lips. You want to do a pop-up? I want to do a midnight feast that Victor can't touch, I said, standing up and wiping the soot from my forehead. But first, I need you to stop being my bodyguard and start being my partner. Tell me why Victor said he found me first. Henry sighed, a heavy sound that echoed in the narrow alley. He's a sensory scavenger. Years ago, before I ever saw you at the market, Victor told me he'd found a source of pure energy in the city. He described you perfectly: the red truck, the fierce temper. He wanted to harvest you. I wrote that one-star review to make the source look like a failure so he'd lose interest. I wasn't trying to ruin you, Saff. I was trying to hide you. I felt a surge of heat in my chest that had nothing to do with the fire. So your no taste in tacos was actually a no taste for Victor? Exactly, Henry said, standing up and pulling me into a fierce, protective hug. But I underestimated you. I didn't realize that hiding Sandra Jones is like trying to hide the sun under a bucket. Damn right, I muttered into his chest. We need a kitchen, he said, his voice regaining its alpha authority. But not mine, not yours. There's a place on the old pier, an abandoned cannery. The acoustics are terrible. The lighting is worse, but it's the only place Victor's frequency can't reach because of the salt in the air. Let's go, I said. I have a special recipe for scavengers that involves a lot of garlic and an even larger amount of humility. As we started toward his car, the rain began to pour, a cold, heavy deluge that washed the soot from our skin. But just as we reached the end of the alley, a fleet of black motorcycles swerved in, blocking our path. The riders weren't shifters. They were humans, their eyes clouded with the same gray film as Victor's. He's not waiting for the midnight feast, Henry growled, his eyes flashing gold. He's changing the rules. Chapter 12. The Taste of Submission. Stay behind me, Henry commanded, but I was already reaching for the heavy iron skillet I'd salvaged. If one more person tells me to stay behind them today, I'm going to start swinging, I snapped. The motorcyclists didn't attack with weapons. They just sat there, revving their engines in a rhythmic, dissonant pattern that made my head throb. It was a sensory attack, a wall of sound designed to paralyze a shifter. Henry groaned, dropping to one knee as he clutched his ears. The noise. It's a feedback loop, he yelled. I looked at the riders. They were like puppets, their movements synchronized. I realized they weren't listening to the engines. They were projecting Victor's will through the sound. Close your eyes, Henry, I shouted, stepping forward. Don't listen to the engines. Listen to me. I began to hum, a low, steady tune I'd used to keep rhythm in the truck during the busiest rushes. It was a simple, grounding melody, in the soul of the Spice Vixen. I walked toward the lead rider, my skillet held high, and began to sing the ingredients of my grandmother's secret salsa. Tomato, onion, serrano, lime. The riders faltered. The rhythmic engine noise started to break apart as my voice created a new, organic frequency. I reached the lead rider and whacked the front of his bike with the skillet. The hollow clang of the iron was like a gong that shattered the gray cloud in his eyes. He slumped over the handlebars, his engine stalling. One by one, the other riders blinked and shook their heads, the leech effect breaking as my voice provided a real-world anchor. They didn't even look at us. They just turned their bikes around and sped off, looking confused. Henry stood up, breathing hard. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. You just flavored a sensory attack. I told you, I said, putting the skillet back in my bag. It's all about the balance. Now, let's get to the pier before Victor realizes his soundtrack just got remixed. The cannery was a cavernous, echoing space that smelled of sea salt and old wood. It was perfect. We set up a makeshift kitchen using a portable burner and the supplies Henry had hidden there, just in case. "This is the third tasting, Saff," Henry said, his voice quiet as I prepped the final dish. "The one for submission, but not to the council, not to Victor." "To what then?" I asked, stirring the chocolate ganache for the vixen's heart. "To us," he said, stepping into the small circle of light from our lantern. "Victor wants to harvest your energy because he thinks it's a resource. I want it because it's you. When I'm submitting to the fact that I can't do this without you. Not as an alpha, but as a man." He took the spoon from my hand and set it down. He looked into my eyes, and for the first time, there was no noise in his gaze. It was just Henry. "I love you, Sandra. Not because the wolf told me to, but because you're the only person who ever looked at a billionaire werewolf and told him his taste in tacos sucked." I felt the last of my fierce defenses crumble. I didn't need a scroll or a pack legacy. I just needed this man, this kitchen, and the fire we built together. "I love you too, you golden-eyed grump," I whispered, pulling him down for a kiss that tasted like chocolate, salt, and the promise of a very long, very spicy future. The moment was perfect. It was quiet. It was intimate. It was everything we had fought for. And then, the massive iron doors of the cannery were blown off their hinges by a blast of violet light. Victor stepped into the room, but he wasn't alone. He was holding a glowing, pulsating orb, the literal soul of the pack's legacy, and he was laughing. "The submission was a lovely touch, Henry," Victor sneered. "But while you were busy playing chef, I was busy stealing the heart of your kingdom. And now I think it's time to see what happens when an alpha has nothing left to lead." He raised the orb, and a wave of gray, lifeless energy began to pour out, turning everything it touched to ash, including the ingredients for our final meal. Chapter 13. The Grand Retraction. The gray wave of energy hit the prep table like a physical wall of silence. I watched, horrified, as my rare chilies shriveled into gray husks and my fresh cilantro turned to dust. Victor stood there with that glowing orb, looking like a man who had just deleted the concept of joy from the world. "The vixen's heart is broken, Sandra," Victor sneered, his gray eyes shimmering with stolen power. "What is a chef without her ingredients? You're just a woman in a drafty warehouse with a portable burner and a very loud mouth." Henry roared, his body trembling as he fought the urge to shift. The gray energy was leaching the gold from his eyes, turning them a dull, leaden amber. He was weakening, the sensory madness he'd feared his whole life finally closing in because Victor was sucking the life out of the room. "Henry, don't look at the orb!" I screamed, grabbing his face with my hands. "Look at me! Focus on the salt!" "The salt," Henry gasped, his breath coming in ragged hitches. "The air, Henry. Smell the salt from the pier." I wasn't just being poetic. Salt was the ultimate cleanser, the one mineral that resisted decay. Victor can kill the plants, but he can't kill the ocean. I turned to the table. Most of my supplies were gone, but the heavy iron pot of water I'd set to boil was still there, protected by the heat. I grabbed a handful of coarse sea salt from a jar I'd tucked under the table and threw it into the water. "You think salt and water can stop me?" Victor laughed, stepping closer. The violet light from the orb pulsed, and the floorboards beneath his feet began to rot. "It's not just salt and water, you hack," I snapped, my fierce energy returning with a vengeance. "It's a retraction. You told the city my food had no soul. You told Henry he was empty, but you're the one who has to steal a literal orb just to feel a spark. I didn't have my peppers, but I had my Spice Vixen spirit." I grabbed the only thing that hadn't turned to ash, a bottle of high-proof agave spirit I'd brought for the ganache. I poured it into the boiling salt water and struck a match. A pillar of blue and orange flame erupted from the pot. It wasn't the violet, sickly fire of Victor's magic. It was a clean, searing heat. I grabbed a heavy iron ladle and began to stir the boiling brine, the steam rising in a thick, salty cloud that cut through the gray fog. "Henry, now!" I yelled. Henry understood. He inhaled the salty steam, the mineral scent grounding his haywire senses. The leaden color in his eyes shattered, replaced by a gold so bright it was nearly white. He stood up, his broad shoulders blocking Victor's path. "You made one mistake, Victor," Henry said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "You thought the soul was in the food, but the soul is the woman who makes it." Henry lunged, not for Victor, but for the orb. But as his hand touched the pulsating surface, the gray energy didn't just push him back. It began to crawl up his arm, turning his skin to stone. Chapter 14. The Midnight Feast. "Henry!" I screamed, reaching for him, but he shoved me back with his good arm. "Don't touch it, Saff. It's a black hole." Victor was laughing now, a high, manic sound. "He's right. The heart of the pack isn't a gift, it's a vacuum. It takes everything. It takes the alpha's strength, the mate's devotion, and it leaves nothing but the gray." I looked at the stone crawling up Henry's arm, and I looked at the blue flame in my pot. I had no more ingredients, no more tricks, and no more time. But I had the master rules. And rule number 1 of a high-stakes romance is that you never, ever let the villain have the last word. "The heart wants a feast?" I hissed, grabbing the boiling pot of agave brine with my bare hands, the heat searing my palms. "Then let's give it a taste of the real Vixen." I didn't throw the water at Victor. I threw it directly into the glowing orb. The reaction was instantaneous. The salt hit the vacuum of the energy, and the agave spirit ignited within the orb's core. Instead of a gray wave, a massive explosion of white-hot steam and blue fire filled the cannery. The pressure was so intense, it blew the remaining windows outward, the sound of the ocean rushing in to fill the vacuum. For a second, there was total, blinding silence. As the steam cleared, I saw Henry on the ground, his arm no longer stone, but his eyes were closed. Victor was gone, literally vaporized by the reaction of pure, grounding salt against his hollow energy. The orb lay on the floor, cracked and dull, its violet light extinguished. "Henry? Henry, wake up!" I knelt beside him, my heart breaking. "The review, I haven't seen the retraction yet. You can't leave me with a 1-star rating." His eyes fluttered open, the gold returning in soft, warm waves. He looked at me, then at my burned hands. He took them in his touch cool and healing. "Sandra," he whispered. "The taste. It's gone." "What? What's gone?" I asked, panicked. "The noise," he said, sitting up and looking around the ruined cannery. "The static. The constant screaming of the world. It's quiet. And for the first time in my life, it's just quiet." He stood up, pulling me with him. We stood in the center of the wreckage, the moon shining through the holes in the roof. The alpha power was still there, but it felt different, less like a weapon and more like a hearth. "We did it," I said, leaning my head against his chest. "We broke the legacy." "No," Henry said, lifting my chin so I had to look at him. "We rewrote it. But there's a problem, Saff." "What now?" I groaned. "The council," he said, gesturing toward the entrance. I turned. The 5 elders were standing there, but they weren't in suits. They were in their wolf forms, their heads bowed low. Behind them, a fleet of black SUVs was parked, but they weren't blocking us. They were forming a corridor. "They aren't here to fight," Henry said, his voice filled with a new kind of authority. "They're here for the transition. But Sandra, look at the news." I pulled out my phone. Every screen in the city was flashing the same image. the white estate in flames, and a viral video of me pepper spraying a beta. But beneath the chaos, there was a new headline, pinned to the top of every food blog and news site in the country. The Alpha's final review: 5 stars isn't enough for the woman who saved my soul. It's beautiful, I whispered, tears pricking my eyes. It is, Henry said, but look at the bottom of the post. I scrolled down. The retraction was there, but so was a link. A link to a live stream that was currently broadcasting from the docks. I looked up, and through the shattered doors, I saw the headlights of 1,000 cars. The city was coming. And they didn't want the billionaire. They didn't want the Alpha. They wanted the tacos. I have no truck, Henry, I said, a laugh bubbling up in my throat despite the tears. I have no ingredients. I have no staff. You have a pack, Henry said, gesturing to the wolves. And you have a billionaire who's very good at logistics. But Sandra, there's one thing I haven't told you about the Blood Moon contract. What? He pointed to the cracked orb on the floor. A tiny, brilliant green sprout was pushing its way through the center of the stone. The feast didn't just break the debt, he said, his voice trembling. It planted a new one. And this one requires a sacrifice that neither of us planned for. Chapter 15. 5 stars and a forever. I stared at the tiny green sprout pushing through the cracked, blackened surface of the orb, and it looked like a common cilantro seedling, but it pulsed with a soft, rhythmic emerald light that matched the beating of my own heart. The air in the cannery suddenly felt different, less like a graveyard and more like a garden after a summer rain. Henry, you're using that billionaire mystery voice again, I said, trying to keep my fierce edge even as my eyes stayed glued to the plant. What sacrifice? I've already sacrificed my truck, my palms, and my favorite red dress. If the universe wants my secret salsa recipe, it's going to have to fight me for it. Henry walked over to the sprout, kneeling before it like it was a holy relic. The heart of the pack was a vacuum because it was empty, Sandra. It was a vessel for power with no purpose. But your midnight feast, you didn't just fight Victor. You poured your actual life force into that salt and agave. You gave it a soul. He looked up at me, his golden eyes filled with a terrifying, beautiful clarity. The legacy isn't a debt anymore. It's a living thing. But it can't survive in a vault or a library. It has to be nurtured. The sacrifice isn't about giving something up. It's about staying. For good. Staying? I asked, my breath catching. You mean the estate? The estate, the pack, the city, Henry said, standing up and taking my hands. The Golden Alpha is gone. The council isn't looking for a weapon anymore. They're looking for a heartbeat. And that heartbeat is you. They don't want a billionaire to lead them. They want a chef to feed them. But it means you can never go back to being just a girl with a food truck. You'd be the matriarch of the North. I looked out at the thousands of headlights gathering at the pier. The people were waiting. My pack, the wolves in the shadows, was waiting. My fierce, independent spirit should have been screaming for the exit, but for the first time in my life, the idea of belonging didn't feel like a cage. It felt like an empire. Matriarch? I let out a sharp, dry laugh. That sounds a lot like manager, and I'm already the best at that. But if I'm doing this, we're doing it my way. No more suits, no more gray, and the first order of business is the pier. I walked to the shattered doors of the cannery and looked out at the crowd. I didn't have a kitchen, but Henry's logistics team was already unfolding tables, and my pack was moving with supernatural speed to set up portable grills. Henry, I barked over my shoulder, stop staring at the plant and get some lime wedges. We have a city to feed. A year later, the Vixen's estate wasn't just a restaurant. It was a legend. We had the food truck parked permanently in the center of the grand ballroom, and the 1-star review was framed in gold above the bar. Henry sat at the corner table, his eyes no longer glowing with madness, but with the quiet, steady heat of a man who had finally found his home. I walked over to him, tossing a towel over my shoulder, my fierce spirit satisfied. "Still 5 stars, Mr. White?" He pulled me into his lap, ignoring the gasps of the visiting dignitaries. "The tacos are excellent, Sandra," he whispered against my neck, his scent now purely cedar and home. "But the chef? She's still the only thing in this world with real taste." I smirked, leaning in for a kiss that tasted like victory. The review was settled. The war was over. And as it turned out, the picky eater was the only person in the world I ever wanted to feed. Hey, gorgeous souls, and welcome back to Eliana's Romance Library. I am so incredibly grateful to have you here in our growing community of romance lovers. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, head to the comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from, or tell me what tropes and stories you want to hear next in our upcoming audiobooks. If you want to take your experience to the next level, consider joining our channel membership. You'll get exclusive early access to all new uploads, plus the ability to binge watch entire story batches before anyone else. Tap that join button to unlock your perks. See you next time.